Thanks. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about account takeover, which is basically how to spot a wolf in sheep's clothing. So as you already heard, I'm Nick, I work at SafeStack. I started about a month ago, so I'm pretty new to the whole security consultant side of things, but I'm loving it. And before then, I was a developer, so hopefully I'll be able to explain some things in ways that developers in here will be able to understand. Yeah, and you can hit me up on Twitter or GitHub at Nick Malcolm. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to look at what is account takeover? Why is it important? Is it important? And how to prevent it, how to detect it, and how to respond to it. And for those of you who are wearing security hats more often, you'll recognize those questions come from a framework called Know, Prevent, Detect, and Respond. And we're going to use this as we go through the talk. Sometimes people have 5 pieces to the pie or different words for the different bits, but basically it boils down to knowing the problem, figuring out how to prevent it, knowing that you can't prevent everything, so you want to detect it when it does happen, and then how do you respond to it when it happens. Cool. So what is account takeover? It's when someone takes over an account, or when someone has a really good sheep's costume and is able to access someone else's account. It's unauthorized account access. How do you know that the person logging in is who they say they are? Does having the right username and right password really mean that it's them? So this is a security conference, but I'll try it anyway. Let's have a show of hands. How many people here know someone else's password? Yeah, okay, sweet. How many people know that someone else knows one of their passwords? Yeah, okay, cool. So we all do it, most of us do it at some point, and we have good reasons for it. There's trade-offs to security, but basically the point is that usernames and passwords aren't enough to prove identity. And so account takeover, most of us will have experienced it through an email that we get from someone like Google or Facebook. So you get an email like this and it says, hey, we've seen someone sign into your account and we want to check if it was you. And what Google is doing on the back end is they're looking for account takeover attacks. And when they're not sure, they send you an email to confirm it, to double check that it was really you. And so in this talk today, we're going to figure out how we can do something similar. But first, how does account takeover attacks happen? There's quite a few ways. A guy called Ryan McGeehan, called Magoo, has created a framework called auth tables, which we'll come to soon. And he's split the account takeover threat into 2 halves. So there's the localized account takeover, which is when something's happened to your device, your laptop or your PC or your browser. There's a piece of malware that's stealing cookies. Someone's listening in on your connection and stealing credentials or cookies as they pass along the wire. Phishing, when you get someone to just give you your credentials because they think it's a real website. Cross-site scripting. And also, Erica in her last talk, which was awesome, and if you missed it, you should listen to it. Erica mentioned Cloudflare. They kind of fall into the localized account takeover problem because recently, earlier this year, they had a bug which splattered unencrypted cookies and parameters into other people's responses. And so I guess the point of that is that if someone gets their account taken over, you can't just blame them for having a bad username and password. There's a whole lot of other things that could have gone wrong to have their credentials stolen. But by far the most common one is remote credential reuse. And that's when someone gets a username and password from a dump, from a database dump, not a rubbish dump, and yeah, uses that to log into their account. And it'll often be bots that just pull down these big dumps and just fire it at websites to see what sticks. Is it a problem? Is this something we have to care about? And if so, why? Yes, it is a problem. So just in 2016, we had, these were some of the top database dumps that we learned about. And some of these dumps had actually been around for multiple years, and we just didn't know about it until then. So there's a billion Yahoo accounts, usernames and passwords that were leaked. MySpace, Adult Friend Finder, LinkedIn, Dropbox. Some of them did have them encrypted, but they were encrypted with like SHA-1 or MD5 or something bad. And so it's effectively as good as plain text credentials. Many of you will be familiar with Have I Been Pwned, which is by an Aussie security researcher called Troy Hunt, and he has a service where you can put in your email address and find out whether you've been affected by any of these dumps. And when credentials show up in one of these, what happens is someone will download it, and then they'll try the exact password and they'll try variations on it. So if your password is ABCD, they'll try ABCDE or ABCD1. So for a lot of people who use weak or predictable passwords, breaches like this have a big impact. So big, in fact, that 63% of confirmed data breaches involved attackers using weak, default, or stolen passwords. And that comes from an industry study that Verizon released last year. So this is a real problem and something that we should take seriously. As Erica also mentioned in her talk, it's showing up in the new OWASP Top 10. So the release candidate for that came out a couple of weeks ago, and a new category in that is A7, insufficient attack protection. And what that's intending to address is basically that credential stuffing attack is one of them, scanners and bots are another, but when automated attacks are hitting your site and trying to break into people's accounts. So we know about account takeover now. What do we know about ourselves? So it's important to know our users or our customers. Are they savvy enough to use good passwords? Hopefully, but not for all of us. Do they reuse passwords? Do they change them frequently? Are they of a good length? Things like that. Will they be willing to use two-factor auth? Because there is a usability trade-off to that, and it can be a bit technical for some people. It's important to know your app. Does your app have a login page? This is a web application security conference, so I'd expect most of us to have web apps with login pages. Is your app storing important information that people would want to steal? Probably, otherwise you wouldn't have customers and you wouldn't be making money. So does this attack apply to me? Probably. But is there lower hanging fruit? Almost certainly. So you want to make sure you've got your servers patched, you've addressed all the other OWASP top 10, but this talk isn't about those. We're going to assume that you've done that, and we're going to learn about account takeover. So how can we prevent it? We want to stop it from happening in the first place. There are some easy ways to help mitigate account takeover attacks. Rate limiting is one. So basically, if someone's attacking you by trying 1,000 different usernames and passwords, realistically, an IP address should only be trying one. Or you can give them a limit of 5 or something, and then you can start throttling them or blocking them or taking some action against that. If your users are able to use 2FA, you should definitely support it, because then you're not relying on usernames and passwords alone. And that's a big win when it comes to account takeover, because then it's not just the username and password. For some of us, we might be able to use an IP whitelist, particularly for admin sections of our websites. We can say, it only needs to be accessed from our company VPN, or if it's some enterprise doohickey, maybe you can say only our customers' VPNs can get in there. Password policies, I really wouldn't recommend password policies because they often do more harm than good, but at a basic level, you should just say, it has to be a certain length, and that can often be a really good starting point. And then the other option is to just outsource the problem entirely and get someone else to deal with it. So support single sign-on via Google or Auth0 or something like that, and then they will do 2FA and account takeover detection for you. So that's some ways to prevent it. How do we detect it? We know we won't stop everything, so let's go about detecting it when it does happen. So we want to spot the wolf. So the goal for account takeover detection is basically to learn what normal looks like for each of our users. What locations do they usually come from, what IP addresses, what cookie, what browser, things like that. And the buzzword that you can go and impress people with is behavioral analytics, or anomaly detection, or user and entity behavioral analytics, or UEBA for short. Yeah, but simple learning and rules can get you pretty far, and that's great. So I want to introduce you to an open source tool called Auth Tables by Ryan McGeehan, who we saw earlier. And if you take nothing away from this talk except thinking I'm going to go Google that, I will be happy. So Auth Tables it's a microservice Docker container that you can spin up. It uses Redis for persistence. And basically, when someone logs in, you send a cookie and an IP address to the Auth Tables service. And then it figures out a network graph of what's normal for that user. And then when something abnormal happens, it'll tell you. And so it's just an API that you hit and you say, is this normal? And it says yes or no. And yeah, the way it does it is by building up an idea of what normal looks like. So for example, a user will have 3 devices, a work laptop, an iPhone, and a desktop computer. And they'll come from some known IP addresses, like the office IP, Wi-Fi networks at home, things like that. And then when they come from a new device or a new IP address, that's when you take action. You realize this is abnormal, and you do something about it. So Auth Tables will look at user ID and cookie and give you a hard pass or a hard fail based on the attributes. And you can also you can add things into this. So it's a pretty you can use whatever attributes you want. And you can also incorporate threat feeds, like if you know your users should never come from Tor, then you can block Tor. And you might anger some people, but you'll probably stop some attacks. Botnets, spammy IPs, things like that. But the problem with it is that it's a hard pass or fail. And another problem is that there's a lot of things that you have to consider when it comes to detection. So Auth Tables is cookies and IP addresses, but then you also have the geolocation of that IP address. Just because an IP address changes doesn't mean that they've actually moved. So you have the velocity between 2 places, browser and operating system, browser fingerprints, like what extensions they're using, things like that. The time of day that they usually access it. So are they a morning person? If their account gets accessed at 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, is that unusual? You can get really technical and look at cursor movement and typing speed. If you're running a physical native app on Android or iPhone, you can use the gyroscope sensors to look at how they're walking and how they touch the phone, how they swipe, how they hold the phone, how they move it around. So there's lots of stuff to track and lots of data to keep, but it can work. So in 2015, Google talked about at Google I/O 2015 a project they ran called Project Abacus, and they found when they combined the different features that they were gathering from their device, how you swipe, how you move, how you type, how you talk, and your face, they got a result which was 10 times more accurate than a fingerprint alone. So we've got Touch ID on our iPhones or Android devices, and they were able to get 10 times more accurate by combining all these factors. And they did this by having 2.8 million sessions, and they got 16 universities worth of brainy boffins to come in and create some cool machine learning algorithms to figure this out. And it wouldn't be an anomaly detection talk if I didn't mention machine learning and big data. So let's get into that. Machine learning is great when you have a lot of data and that you understand that data. And this is harder than people think. It's easy to have a lot of garbage data, and if you put garbage data in, you get garbage out. Garbage in, garbage out. But assuming you have lots of good data and you have the expertise to understand it, there are 2 ways you can train it. So there's supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Supervised is when you have a list of different events, so all these different login events in our case, and someone's going through and saying, yes, this is real, yes, this is real, this is fine, this is fine, this is fine, this one's not, this one's fine, this one's fine, this one's not. And that takes a long time, and it relies on subjectivity and human interaction. And then there's unsupervised learning, which is when you get the computer to do it itself. And the advantage of this is that A, a person's not involved, which is good, and B, that it can spot things that a human can't. So a human might think, oh, that looks all right, but when you use unsupervised learning, it's able to pick up things that a human wouldn't. But then this all folds back on, if you have garbage data, then it's going to think things are real attacks when really they're not. So you have to feed it good stuff, or it will be unhealthy. So if you want to go down the machine learning track, probably the first thing on your list to check off will be an algorithm called one-class support vector machines. And basically this is like drawing a line in the sand and saying, is it them or is it not them? The one class bit means that we're only training the model on one class of data. So we know that the last 6 months of history for this user is very likely to be all realistic, and we have no examples of bad data. So we can't train a two-class machine. We only have one class of data. We train it on that, and it figures out a line to draw around it. And that's what the support vector machine bit, it's basically a way of measuring distances between data points and drawing a line and doing fancy things. And that's glossing over a lot of detail because it's really hard to understand, but if you want to Google something, Google one-class SVMs. There are Python libraries you can get to do this. It's all free, all open source. And if you don't want to get down and dirty in the code, Azure at least has an API for one-class support vector machines. So you could play around on the free tier with that. But yeah, machine learning is hard and will take a while to get right. You can bring it back to a higher level view where you just boil it down to maths. So instead of a hard pass or fail, we'll just look at the probabilities. What's the probability that they come from this IP? What's the probability that they change IP? If you're a traveling salesperson, you are more likely to be someone who changes IP every 10 minutes or whatever because you're driving down the road and transiting through different cell phone towers. So the probability of changing your location is high, and so when it does change, that's good. And if you stay still for too long, then that's actually a sign that maybe something is wrong. So statistics can take you away from the hard pass and fail to a probabilistic approach, and it's not as hard as machine learning. So you can use simple pass or fail with auth tables, you can get a bit smarter with statistics, and if you have the resources, you can look at a machine learning approach. Or you can pay someone to do it for you, and there are different tools and solutions out there, but they generally start to cost a lot of money. Yeah, so that's detection. We've detected something. We think we've spotted a wolf in sheep's clothing. What do? Do we just say, okay, whatever, or do we do something? What now? So there's a few approaches we can take. The most common one is to alert the user out of band, and that's what we saw with the Google approach. They send you an email and it says, hey, we noticed this. Another thing you can do if you're selling to people who use Slack, you can add a Slack integration and it says, hey, we noticed you log in. Was this you? And Slack and Dropbox actually use this approach themselves. Another approach you can do is just block the activity completely. So you think it's a wolf, you just say, okay, now you're logged out. You can't log back in anymore. You've cut off the activity, you've ended the session. You could block them through a firewall if you need to. And then a kind of in-between approach is step-up authentication. So you think it's a wolf, we're like, prove that it's really you. I'm going to send you a 2FA prompt and you have to tap it on your phone. And yeah, you could ask for answers to security questions, but don't do security questions. They're bad. Yeah, so distributed alerting, so that's a Facebook alert. I like this one a bit better because with the Google one, the response that you could make as a user is kind of hidden. It's like you get this alert, you're like, what do I do? I don't know. And for a lot of your users, this is going to be a really scary interaction with your service. So it's important to think about the user experience of how you walk them through this potentially serious situation. So with Facebook, they give you a nice big button that says review the login, so that you can empower your users to respond well to this potential threat. I mentioned Slack. So what they do is they detect an event happening and they message that person in Slack and say, was this you? Please do a 2FA. Dropbox made an open source tool called SecurityBot. So if you like this approach, you can go have a look at that. And the idea with this is that you're doing distributed alerting. So if you detect a wolf and you just send that alert to your security team or to a sysadmin, it's going to sit in their email inbox until they get to it, or they might just end up ignoring it, and that's a bad thing. So what you do is you distribute the workload of responding to alerts by sending it to someone who is able to respond to it. And if the user is really logging into your app, then they will be awake and they will see an email come in and they'll click, yes, it was me. And if they're asleep, then they're not going to respond to that email, and you can assume something weird is happening. So we've looked at the cycle of know, prevent, detect, and respond. We know the account takeover threat as it applies to us. We know how to prevent it with 2FA or with rate limiting password policies. We know how to detect it, and we know how to respond to it. And the cool thing about this is once you've got this system going, you can make this feedback loop a lot tighter. So you can detect and respond before they log in. So before they hit enter, or before you give them a session ID, you can say, this isn't you. Or before they go and transfer $50 to some random account or $500, you can say, hey, I'm pretty sure you look suspicious. I'm going to force you to do step-up authentication. So you're using detection and response as prevention, and you've tightened that whole feedback loop. Yeah, so that's a really quick, fast introduction to protecting and defending against the account takeover threat. Hopefully you'll end up with a scenario where you can shoot the wolf. Yeah, so if you have any questions, come talk to me afterwards, and thanks so much for your time.